All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. So today is our 8th day of the Arab Center Winter School. The end is in sight for all of our participants. But we have a very exciting topic today on state resilience in Iran. So this is quite a timely and interesting topic. And with us to give this lecture is Dr. Mehran Kamrava. Let me just introduce him briefly before beginning. He's the director of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and he's professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. His most recent books include A Concise History of Revolution, published with Cambridge University Press in 2020. Congratulations. And Troubled Waters, Insecurity in the Persian Gulf, as well as Inside the Arab State and many others. I honestly will take a lot of time to read through his illustrious CV. But Dr. Kamrava is the series editor for the Contemporary Issues in the Middle East series at Syracuse University Press, and Iran and the World series at Hearst Publishers and Oxford University Press. And yeah, he's quite a prolific scholar in Middle East politics and an expert on Iran specifically. So he will be giving the lecture today for up to an hour, Dr. Mehran, and I will give you a 15-minute time check and then a 5-minute time check. So yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Donna. I appreciate it. And thanks for that warm introduction. I don't know if I'll have an hour worth of things to say. It would be good to have a robust discussion. It's a pleasure being here and an honor being here. And I hope to discuss with you something that has puzzled me for the last several months and something that I've been trying to wrap my own head around. And that's the question of why is it that the Islamic Republic state has proven so resilient despite itself, despite considerable pressure domestically and despite considerable pressure from the outside. We know, for example, that since 2018 at least, and even before that, the United States has embarked on what it calls the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And of course, we've seen periodic and quite intense and often violent eruptions of protests and demonstrations in Iran across the spectrum, not just in the major cities, but in fact, more troubling for the state in a number of towns and smaller cities across the country. And although one might see a little bit of coordination and outside coordination to these protests, nevertheless, the bulk of these protests are a result of domestic pressures that are built up and erode and come to the surface in the country. So the question really that I think is worth asking is why is it that the state has proven so resilient despite everything, despite its own policies that antagonize and alienate its population across class spectrum and across the country, and despite incredible pressure that has that is brought to bear on it from the outside, both by the United States, but also in terms of its international political economy and the fact that the country is cut off. And there are a number of reasons really that that we can point to in terms of why is it that the state has been so remarkably resilient. But I want to highlight 4 primary institutional causes for the resilience of the state. I want to focus primarily at the reasons, at the institutional reasons, the structural reasons that have made the state so remarkably resilient for a whole variety of reasons. And these 4 causes or 4 factors can broadly be divided into the complexity, institutional complexity, and structural complexity of the various institutions of the state. Second, a deep state that has been quite robust and maintains the essence and the core of the Islamic Republic state. Third, there are a number of elite dynamics that serve as safety valves of one kind or another. So intra-elite dynamics are quite important. And last but by no means least are opportunities for institutional rent seeking that the state itself provides for a cohort of political elites. And therefore, they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and in maintaining, ensuring that the state survives. So let me spend a little bit of time on each of these. But first, before I talk about each of these, let me reiterate what I started with, which is the fact that the state is under stress. When we look at the Islamic Republic state in Iran, we see a state under tremendous stress. And this is a state that is in many ways gifted in crisis management. In fact, you might make a credible argument that the Iranian state cannot really govern normally, if there is such a thing as normal governance. It's used to going from one crisis to another, and it is over the course of the last 4 decades, it has accumulated an extensive repertoire of crisis management techniques and crisis management tools. And it, in many ways, survives in crises. It survives and thrives in crises. But nevertheless, what these crises have resulted is chronic political instability in Iran. Chronic political instability that has resulted in mounting sanctions and, of course, the international status as, for many, a pariah state. But also what is occurring is the fact that there is tremendous ideologically imposed and ideologically dictated limitations on the urban classes. So the urban classes find life tremendously frustrating in Iran, middle classes on. And if you talk to state supporters, they agree that their base of legitimacy is shrinking, that there is a base of legitimacy that is at its core about 20% of the population. If you look at parliamentary elections, if you look at presidential elections, by all accounts, these presidential and parliamentary elections usually rank about 50% and higher. The least participation was in the last parliamentary elections in about a year ago, which was about 40%. And that was the lowest that Iran has ever had in terms of, or one of the lowest that it has had in terms of its parliamentary elections. So if we take election participation as a yardstick for state legitimacy, we can argue that, well, this is a state that has a fair amount of legitimacy among a good chunk of the population, because routinely about 50 to 60% of the population takes part in presidential elections, and just about as many take part in parliamentary elections. Usually parliamentary elections in Tehran, the capital, rate about 30%, but they're significantly higher in other cities, in some places as high as 60% or so. And so what we see is, at least if we take elections as a yardstick and popular participation, the state tends to be remarkably, or at least relatively legitimate or considered legitimate. But really, when we examine and when we talk to people on the right of the political spectrum and we talk to stalwarts of the state, they say they admit that they really have legitimacy. They have diehard loyalty of about 20% of the population. And it's that other 80% that protests when there's a sudden price hike in petrol, as there was in November, December of 2019, when there are so-called what we call bread riots, when there are sudden price hikes or sudden outbursts among the population. So there are domestic, so this is by and large a restless population. It's a population that is not fully on board, and there is tremendous frustration. Now, of course, we can go into a whole variety of discussions or discuss a whole variety of reasons why these outbursts and protests have not yet evolved into social movements, and that, of course, can be discussed. We can discuss that, but the point is that the state doesn't necessarily have wide popularity, at least among 80% of the population. If they get a chance, they express their anger, they express their population. So what is it about the state? What are some of the institutional characteristics that allow the state to stay in power? So let's first talk about the complexity of the institutional makeup of the state. This is a state that is tremendously complicated. It is highly complex in its ability to penetrate various echelons of society. It is not a state that has shallow roots in society. And through various institutions, it's like an octopus that has its arms across and throughout various echelons of the state. For example, when we look at the executive, we can say, yes, at the apex, the executive is divided between the leader, Velayat Faqih, and the president. But you scratch the surface and you see that actually the leader has representatives across state institutions. So the leader's representatives are at various government ministries, they're at various economic foundations, they are at various provinces and various provincial capitals and provincial towns. And of course, there is the very important and often understudied institution of the Friday prayer imam. That speaks to that 20%. That is important. That ideologically buttresses the loyalty of the population among that 20% that can be called upon in moments of need by the state. So on the one hand, we have this state that ensures its ideological resonance through the institution of the Friday prayer imam among its core constituency and its loyal and diehard followers. And then, of course, there are a whole variety of other institutions that try to perpetuate a semblance of legitimacy among the population. And they try to foster a sense of belonging by the state. There's the Majlis, there's city councils, there are institutions that are meant to represent the population. There's the presidency. And interesting, what we've seen for each presidency, for each presidential election, is that in the lead up to the election, almost all stakeholders within the state, it's almost as if they all sing from the same page, read from the same page, and they all try and get the vote out. And so it's an interesting phenomenon where we have people resorting to social media, YouTube, Facebook, whatever is available and out there to try and get out the vote. And this isn't just people on the right of the political spectrum. We also have the so-called reformists, and I'll mention those. So we have, in many ways, a set of complex institutions up and down. There are institutions that check the system. There's, for example, the Guardian Council. There is the Expediency Council. All of these councils that try to ensure that the state operates as smoothly as possible. Of course, within the confines of its own ideological construct, within the confines of its own agendas and its own priorities and goals. But there are institutions that check the system internally. There are institutions that secure the system. such as the Intelligence Ministry, the IRGC, law enforcement. So ultimately, what we have from these institutions and the complexity and depth of these institutions is an ability to penetrate society and an ability to ensure the state's ideological legitimacy among that 20% that I discussed. So we have a very complicated and complex institution. But it's not an institution it's not just that. There's more to it than what I just told you. A second factor is the deep state. A second cause for the resilience of the Iranian state is the pervasive and depth of the deep state that ensures that at its core, the state remains the same and remains resilient. This deep state, which has not necessarily been studied so far, is made up of the Qom Theological Association, the Qom Theological Establishment. This is the core, the ideological core of the state that resides not in Tehran, but in the religious city of Qom. There's, of course, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is the primary crack unit Praetorian arm of the state. There is the shadow cabinet and the shadow state that is at the disposal of the leader. You notice, incidentally, I call it leader, not the supreme leader. There's no such title as supreme leader in Iran. It's the correct title is leader, but journalistically, we just call it supreme leader. And then, of course, there's the representatives that I mentioned that the leader has in universities, in government institutions, and in various towns and cities. So, whereas the various formal institutions of the state are really meant to penetrate society and to inculcate and ensure the state's ideological robustness among successive cohorts of stakeholders, the deep state is primarily an instrument of control. It is made up of a series of instruments of control. The Qom Theological Establishment ensures the ideological purity and the continuance of the Islamic nature of the Islamic Republic state. The IRGC ensures that domestic opposition and opponents are kept at a minimum and that they are effectively suppressed. The Intelligence Ministry of Intelligence and the intelligence of the IRGC, there are incidentally two main competing intelligence units. There's the Ministry of Intelligence that's ostensibly civilian, and it's what in Arabic we call mukhabarat. And then there is the IRGC intelligence, which is far more draconian and far more difficult to get out of. These are all meant to be instruments of control. They're all meant to be instruments of control. So I've now talked about two of these institutional characteristics: the complexity of the institutions, of institutional makeup, and the deep state. A third feature is intra-elite dynamics that ensure there is a certain amount of safety valve within the Islamic Republic. That basically, if you agree with the overall goals of the revolution, that there is enough elite rotation within the cadre of political leaders in the Islamic Republic, that there's something in it for you, that you can, that other 30-40% of the population can get out and go and vote come election time, that at least they remain compliant, if not non-conformist, that at least they agree with the overall goals of the state, whatever their goals might be. So what we have within the power elite are ideological fractures. And over time, these ideological fractures have had different names. From 1979 on, we've given them different names. We've called them conservative construction or developmentalists. We've called them reformists. Now, these days, we call them principalists versus moderates. But what we have are ideological fractures within the elite. And these ideological fractures are quite manageable. These are not ideological fractures that have pushed the state to the precipice and have pushed it towards collapse. These ideological fractures exist and are quite deep, and competition between them can be quite fierce and often at times quite nasty. In fact, they can be quite nasty, the way we saw in 2009. But ultimately, what we see is that this factional politics within the state serves as a fair amount of safety valve. It serves a safety valve function that enables the system to maintain itself and to preserve itself over time. So what we have in Iran really, in many ways, is a hybrid authoritarian system. Now, granted, over the last decade or so, this hybrid authoritarian system has moved increasingly towards lack of rigidity and lack of flexibility. It has really, in many ways, moved to such a degree of rigidness, with the Guardian Council that has vetting power, getting rid of reformist candidates for parliament, for presidency, with the former reformist, the former prime minister of the regime has been under house arrest for now more than a decade. Former bastion of the state, Mehdi Karoubi, has been under house arrest. So this is the regime that is the state that won't hesitate to turn on its own, and it really has gotten rid of its own flexibility in many ways. But nevertheless, given the fact that now we still have so-called moderates, people who call themselves moderates, given the fact that there is a semblance, although oftentimes skin deep and not terribly meaningful, but there's a semblance of political parties, given the fact, more importantly, that today there is an ongoing process of generational change in Iran, with the first generation of revolutionaries either retiring or dying off one after another, and a new generation is coming to power. Given the fact that the elite changes and there is a rotation among the faces, yes, there are those constant faces, the most readily recognizable of those constant faces being Khamenei himself, but nevertheless, there is this generational change that is unfolding and occurring as we speak. That in itself has resulted in a certain level of preservation of the system. That has enabled the system to maintain itself and to be able to regenerate itself, reproduce. One of the really fascinating developments that has occurred, it actually has been now about 3 years in the making, is the fact that Khamenei has replaced a lot of the, almost all of the Friday prayer imams, and that a new generation of Friday prayer imams have now come to the fore and have been taking the lead on representing the system at the local grassroots level, and that is important. So there's the safety valve function of the state as well. Last, but by no means least, is the fact that the state itself is a source of riches. Let's not forget, the state itself is a source of riches for people who have a vested interest in maintaining the system. And these are not just clerics, these are not just the highest echelons of the state. These are people who actively benefit from the political system as it exists and as it has evolved. This is what you might call institutional rent seeking, and this is part of the parlance in Iran. Everybody talks about this institutional rent seeking in Iran. What we see is that an interesting development happens. So you have, as I mentioned, you have the a generational change that is unfolding. A lot of these generations, a lot of the younger of these guys come from IRGC backgrounds. And what happens is a lot of the first and second generation IRGC folks retire from the IRGC. And of course, they maintain their ties and they maintain their connections and maintain their access to their privileged access. And then they go into business. They become entrepreneurs. But these entrepreneurs, of course, need state dependence. They need state resources. They need state connections, which they already have. And so that's one way of state benefit that gets accrued to the population. Another way in which state benefits are accrued is through what the state has been embarked in on its own, particularly since Ahmadinejad came to power in 2005, but even before that, which is privatization and sale of state assets. And privatization and sale of state assets, of course, means that those people who have the best connections, those people who have the best resources, those people who have access to information get the primary ability to access these sales. And so the sale of state resources, this privatization or the emergence of the semi-private sector in Iran, state-private partnerships that have become quite common, have become a source of tremendous wealth. And for some, it's a source of overnight riches. But even if you are not necessarily quite wealthy, there's a fair segment of the population that is directly benefiting from what the state stands for and what the state does. And so this is quite common. So the state itself is a source of wealth, and as a result, it maintains an entire population around it, which have vested interests in maintaining it. These are people who are either in the private sector or who are in the semi-private sector, and they overtly have one leg in the private sector and one leg in the state. So that's a broad overview. Where do we stand? And let me just end with a couple of notes on whether the Islamic Republic, what's going to happen. Actually, I know we often talk about this, and I know political scientists like to talk about the fact that we're at the verge of historic changes. But if you look at Iran, change has been taking place, in fact. As I mentioned, there's a generational change that has been going on. There's a minister government minister, cabinet minister, minister of IT and information technology and communication technology, who's in his 30s. And everybody talks about the young minister. So there is a change that's going on. And the leader, who has been increasingly more active in the political process since 2009, Khamenei, is in his 80s. He's in his early 80s. So even supreme leaders die at some point. And so we're likely to have a major change occurring, at least at the very top. Now, no doubt, a government like Iran, a state like Iran, has already engaged in detailed succession planning. But even with detailed succession planning, there's bound to be certain tectonic changes that occur when the personality of the leader changes. The question is, will Iran go the China model? I think that's the big question that is confronting Iran. Will Iran begin to lose more and more of its ideological character as in the next decade or so? And at least in terms of rhetoric, in terms of its base. And will it become kind of a hollow shell of Islamic State while it engages in developmentalism? There is a school of thought that says Iran is a developmental state. That if you look at it, there's a book by Kevin Harris, a very social revolution, that maintains that Iran is a developmental state. And as a developmental state, it has performed remarkably well despite the various pressures on it. The question is, what will happen to its ideological character if that developmental state will continue? My bet, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, but if I were, I'd bet that the state will continue to remain resilient. It will not necessarily collapse. That things like maximum pressure have only helped enhance its ability to engage in crisis management and to deepen its legitimacy. It has only strengthened the proverbial right, but that this is a state that will continue to be resilient. It will no doubt change because there's an impending change at the top that's likely to occur. It could very well be another cohort of Khamenei that comes from the experts, from the Assembly of Experts, which is made up of octogenarians, but surely the character of the state is going to change, but it's likely to remain resilient. I think I'll stop here and try and answer any questions that might have come up during the process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehran. So now we can open up to Q&A. So if there's anybody who has questions at this point, I have a couple, but I don't want to go first.
Dana, I should mention that this is a subject of a book that I've been working on for the last year or so. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad to have this opportunity to test some of these ideas and to think through some of these questions. I don't pretend to have answers, but it would be good to engage in a conversation and a dialogue about some of these.
Definitely. And yeah, I mean, it's quite connected to a lot of the papers and some of the themes that we've already been discussing. So I think Maria has a question to start out with. Maria?
Yes, good afternoon. It was really interesting. I'm not an expert at all in Iran. I actually know very little. So it was really interesting to hear you talk about how the state works. I just have a question. I was wondering, all this state structure, how powerful is it in the whole of the territory? Is it more like it happens in other countries, which is more powerful close to the capital, close to the big cities, or is it also capable of having the same control over the population, the institutions, etc., all over the territory? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I don't think anyone really has the answer to that, because what we saw in 2019 in particular, when there were these massive riots and protests across the country, oftentimes they happened in small cities. And they were not necessarily all of them in the peripheries of the country, but they happened not in big cities. And so the question is, why did they happen in some smaller cities? And you can say that, well, it's because in these cities, state services are the most lacking. And it's not so much the state repressive capacity that is weakened, but the state's services are the most lacking, and therefore popular anger and resentment is the most pronounced in these cities. So I don't know the answer to your question. And again, I don't know if anybody knows the answer to your question. But here's something to consider. There's been a division of labor that has emerged between the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Iranian military. And the Iranian military, the regular military, is meant to be in charge of the defense of the country. The IRGC is meant to be in charge of defending the revolution and also the near abroad of the country. So if you go to Iraq, if you go to Afghanistan, the borders of the country, it's the IRGC that is in charge of defending those places. So my sense is that it's the IRGC that is pervasive in the margin, in the border areas, border towns, and that as a result, they would be the ones that would be cracking down. These protests of 2019, and there were also protests in October of 2018, they were actually in central but smaller towns. So the dispersion is not of state control isn't centralized, and we can't say, well, state control is weak in peripheral areas. I think what we do see is that state services are not as robust in some of the smaller towns, and as a result, popular anger can manifest itself in haphazard protests. So there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about provision of piped water, clean water, and housing in cities distant from Tehran.
Very interesting. Kind of subnational variations are always fascinating. So we have Aisha next. Aisha, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. So my question might be a little looking ahead in the future, but I was wondering specifically with the pandemic, and we saw a lot of governments failing at basic healthcare to their citizens. And one thing that we recently saw was Khamenei actually advocating against the US and UK vaccine. So do you think that's going to be a factor in them lacking effective governance throughout Iran, and that's going to actually contribute to the future? And yeah, like I said, it's a very futuristic question. So
no, Aisha, that's an excellent question. It might have to do with the future or a little bit of speculation, but here at the Iranian Studies Unit, we did a paper on the COVID pandemic in Iran. And one of the things that this paper discusses is that actually, and this is something that this kind of, if you look at Iran as a developmental state model, one of the things we see is that the state has been really successful at providing basic services. So electrification, basic education, basic healthcare, and the state has been, and basic vaccination, eradication of polio, for example. Those kinds of things, the state has had remarkable success. So the question is, but COVID caught everybody around the world by surprise, and we hear these horror stories coming out of superpower, the United States. I was just reading that in Los Angeles County, there's one death every 8 minutes because of COVID. So the problem that this pandemic is posing isn't so much vaccination, it's hospitalization and the delivery of primary care rather than basic care. The delivery of things like ventilators and kind of resuscitating people who are seriously ill. And so, I don't want to speculate and say, well, Iran is over the hump, because there's no social distancing. People are not taking it seriously. And of course, the government doesn't necessarily give us accurate data. So we don't have a good sense of the scale of the pandemic and where the pandemic stands in Iran. But what we do see, if they reach a level of vaccination, the network, the ability to vaccinate is there. And we are seeing parallel of this in India, because India is saying, just give us the vaccine and we can vaccinate people because we've done it. And my sense is that it's the same in Iran. Now, you ask a very important question. Khamenei came out and said, we will not import vaccines from Britain and the United States. In Iran, there's a proverb. We say, when the cat doesn't have access to milk, he says, well, the milk is spoiled anyway. Iranians really can't get their hands on British or American vaccines anyway because of sanctions. And so in some ways, this is less political and more financial. What he's saying is, China and Russia, we need your vaccine. Now there's news that Iran and Cuba are going to partner for an Iranian vaccine. So, you ask a very important question. And I think once they get their hand on a vaccine, already they have these networks and the ability to vaccinate people. The question is getting their hands on a vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. So next is Arash, if you'd like to ask a question.
Sorry, I had a moment of cutting off. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, I have a bit of an unstable connection, but hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much, Professor Kamrava. This was very illuminating. I have two basic points / questions. There is a joke that predicting Iran is very easy because whatever you say will probably be untrue anyways.
He cut off.
Yeah, I think we lost him again.
Okay. Maybe when he comes back, he can ask his question and maybe keep his video off, and that'll help the bandwidth. Althea, do you want to jump in with your question until we get Arash back?
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting topic. And my question is, in which way this aspect of resilience is also connected with its action outside and with the foreign policy of Iran, if there is a connection with this resilience in institution and the political approach outside.
Yeah. We know that, of course, in scholarship, we know there's a direct connection between domestic policy and the legitimacy of the state and foreign policy, and the fact that the Iranians find themselves under pressure, the fact that the United States behaves the way it does, that the European Union doesn't have the backbone to stand up to the United States, and that the European Union hasn't lived up to its end of the bargain when it comes to the nuclear program. All of these have helped the state justify its positions domestically. All of these have helped the state have deepened its resilience in one form or another. Now, having said this, there's the other side of the coin. The question is, what does Iran have to gain? Forget Syria. What does Iran have to gain from sending fuel to Venezuela? And this is a question that's asked in Iran. You guys just want to antagonize the Americans and send 5 ships to Venezuela? And what does Venezuela do for Iran? And forget, again, this isn't even Syria. or what does Iran gain from sticking with Bashar Assad, and what does Iran gain from its rhetoric against Israel? So these are questions that are asked. And interestingly, over the last couple of months, we have seen responses from the IRGC to some of these questions. So, for example, they've now come out and with a figure. They've said, well, we've spent about, I don't know, I forget the figure. I think it was 20 billion. We've spent about 20 billion on Syria. Nothing. We haven't spent anything on Syria. They're actually trying to address these issues. And every once in a while, you hear some news that then the state has let out, but it denies, saying, well, we have access to such and such gold mine in Syria. And we're in Syria, but we have access to this mine and that mine. And Venezuela is giving us gold. And we might be giving Venezuela fuel, but they're giving us pure gold. And so this is a question that is it's for the state, it's the cost of business. I don't think at least in their calculations, it's not this cost doesn't outweigh the benefit. So these guys are thinking there's more to be gained by being in Syria. There's more to be gained by giving subsidized fuel to Venezuela. There's more to be gained by engaging in anti-Israel rhetoric. Now, they are in Afghanistan and they're in Iraq. That's a little bit more difficult to argue with. So you don't hear Iranians questioning, well, why is the state in Afghanistan? Because the Americans are there. Why is the state in Iraq? Because the Americans are there. And they can justify that more easily than their presence in Syria, for example, or their relationship with Venezuela.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. I really want to jump in, but we cut Arash off earlier. So Arash, if you'd like to ask your question now, and maybe keep the video off so that the bandwidth doesn't get all weak.
Yeah, sorry, I kept the video off. I apologize for the earlier. If it didn't work out this time, I'll keep it up. Just very briefly, thanks again for the lecture. I want to point out to 2 points and get your sort of feedback on them. First of all, within the factions of the regime, I think we've long distinguished between the reformist faction, which since we're East Asian analogies, I'll call it the South Korea faction. That people believe that Iran could be South Korea, basically. Be of a visual thinking, but even if not as prosperous, that it could ideally be a sort of a liberal democratic, and they exist, but they've been marginalized, as you pointed out. But then we have people like Rouhani, who long wanted the China model. Of course, it doesn't help that China has gone through many changes itself through the last 30 years. So China of today is very different than the China before. So my question, I'll cut it short because I think the connection is not good. I'll just ask this one thing actually and go off. Is that do you think there is any chance that the faction of President Rouhani, which represents a faction that wants better relations with the West and wants Iran to be a more normal country, has any chances in the succession fights following Khamenei's death whenever it comes to take over? And I'll stop here. I'm sorry for the internet. I don't know what's going on today in Turkey. Sorry.
No worries.
No worries. Look, your guess is as good as mine. As you know, everybody is now trying to guess who would be a successor to Khamenei. And all sorts of names are thrown around. And recently, I was talking to a reporter who was who knows an awful lot about Iran, certainly knows the ins and outs of what's going on behind the scenes much better than I do. And I said, who's your guess as to who's going to replace Khamenei? And he came out with a name that just blew me away completely. Not one of the names that was anywhere in my bandwidth. And he said Rouhani. And I was just completely floored by that suggestion. I said, I sincerely don't think so. But hey, it is Iran after all, and they managed to surprise us again and again. So I don't know. I think right now we're coming up to a presidential election, and so Iranian politics is particularly suspect right now because everything they do is with an eye towards presidential election. And so we just had the parliament pass a resolution that Israel will disappear in 20 years. This is because the Speaker of the Parliament has run again and again for the presidency. His name is Ghalibaf. And does the guy have a chance? We don't know. So it's very difficult to predict the course of the evolution of the revolution is very difficult to predict. Which way will this revolution evolve? I think one thing that supports what your question is that Rouhani and company, people who are from the participation front, are insiders, and they have an awful lot vested ideologically, politically, institutionally, economically across the system. So it is likely that they have a better shot at it than other factions, than what you call the South Koreanists, or those who advocate the South Korea model. I should say, Donna, if I may,
Yes.
just, I mentioned that for the last year or year and a half, I've been working on a book on Iran. And I wrote my dissertation, PhD dissertation on Iran, just about when the earth cooled, many decades ago. I've studied Iran. I have written about Iran. I study Iran. I live and breathe it. And this country continues to shock and amaze me. I still come across something that I would like to think I know it. I even co-edited an encyclopedia on Iran. So I would like to think I know Iran. And every once in a while, I come across something that just completely blows me away. It is a notoriously unpredictable country, very difficult to predict. So your guess is as good as mine.
That gives the social scientist an anxiety issue. Yeah, I have many questions, but I'm gonna cede ground to our attendees, and then hopefully I'll have time to ask. Yara is next. Yara, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dr. Dana. Thank you, Dr. Mehran, for this intriguing presentation. My question is on the resilience of the regime and the role of the external factor. Now, since 2017, we have been witnessing a new type of demonstrations in Iran. Pre to 2017, we've been mostly seeing demonstrations that are due to structural or institutional factors. For example, the 1999 student demonstrations and the 2009 Green movements in Iran. But since 2017, most of the demonstrations that happened in Iran were due to the economic factor, let me say, which were actually because of the reimposition of the U.S. economic sanctions with Trump. Now, my question is, what do you think is more contributing to the resilience or the de-resilience of the regime, whether it is the internal or the external factor? And how far does the external factor play a role in shaking Iran's resilience in the face of its crises? Thank you.
Thank you. Before I answer that, Yara, I want to just take a minute and if you don't mind, the social scientist in me will come out for a minute. And I want to say this. I was very careful not to use the word regime. And I talked about the state or the system. And a couple of times it slipped out for those of you who might have caught it. And I corrected myself. I have come increasingly to dislike the word regime as a social science concept because of its imprecise nature. And I prefer to use the word to capture the same totality of whatever it is that the word regime or the concept of regime is meant to signify. I prefer the word system. And this is part of it is because of a reaction to what we've seen unfold in the United States. Why is it that every time the West doesn't like a political system, it calls it regime, Bashar Assad regime, but somebody else is an administration? Why not talk about the Trump regime? So I have been trying to retrain myself with difficulty, admittedly, not to use the word regime because of its haphazard application, if not its imprecise nature. So I prefer the word, I don't know, I talk about the state, or if we want to talk about everything, I talk about political system or polity or something other than the word regime. Now, the question you asked, I think, is really important. In some ways, I think the worst enemy that the Islamic Republic has is the Islamic Republic. It isn't the Americans, it's the Islamic Republic, because they actively oftentimes go after alienating the population. In the summers, for example, when it gets hot, suddenly the police start giving out fines to women for being particularly immodest. Suddenly people start getting SMS messages on their phones saying, please report to the police station because your automobile was observed with a woman who didn't wear the hijab properly. So oftentimes this regime is either tone deaf, or if you want to be cynical, it deliberately creates obstacles so that when it gives a little bit of liberty, then people say, fantastic, now we have some freedom. Now, whether it's deliberate or not deliberate, I don't have access to the black box of what goes on inside the state and its policy-making processes to be able to accurately tell you whether these state initiatives are deliberate, kind of cynical, meant to make life deliberately difficult so that when there's a little bit of loosening, people say, yay, long live the Islamic Republic, or if the government is genuinely tone deaf and doesn't understand that these petty limitations truly antagonize the population. My sense is that you ask, is it sanctions that are more biting and create more antagonism, or is it the government itself? I think, first of all, it's a combination of both. But if the government wasn't so tone deaf, if the government was a little bit more responsive to the needs of the people, if the state wasn't so rigid and inflexible, then I think actually people just want to go about their lives. It isn't innately natural for people to protest. People don't necessarily want to go out there and protest. There's an awful lot of hassle that people are willing to put up with because they don't want to break their routine. They don't want to jeopardize the next promotion. They don't want to jeopardize the next whatever. It's not natural to rebel. It's natural. In many ways, it's a lot more easy to be compliant than to be rebellious. And so my sense is that if the government didn't impose these petty restrictions, it would have an a much easier way governing than it does. Even through the sanctions, they have the sanctions do bite. But make no mistake about it, this is a very clever state that has managed to skirt sanctions in a variety of ways. You go to Iran and there is no blackouts. There are blackouts or what they call rolling blackouts in California. Before moving to Doha, I lived in Los Angeles. There are no blackouts. There's availability of goods. Everything is there. It's just a little bit more expensive. The government does deliver, even despite the sanctions, but it is also its own worst enemy in the sense that it deliberately antagonizes the population. It becomes ideologically inflexible. It engages in stupid, petty restrictions. It goes after social media influencers. It does things that are kind of just shocking in some ways and make no political sense.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. So do we have any other questions from the participants before I turn to a social media question? Okay, I don't see any raised hands. All right, so we had a question from social media, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it for brevity. This person asks, I think in the Middle East, we can't separate the concept of deep state, leader, or regime without referring also to the religious character of the country. So the question ends with, do you think change is possible? But I think probably you'd want to speak more to, the religious nature of the Iranian regime and whether or not it's exceptional in that sense.
So let me just start with an anecdote. One time I asked an ambassador from Iran, so someone from the political establishment, I asked this question, is change possible? He said, not until 200 or so ayatollahs in the city of Qom depart from the scene. And that goes to the nature of deep state and the religious character of the state. In the 2000s, we witnessed somewhat of a reformation in Iran. We witnessed a reformation in an intellectual revolution in Iran in the domain of state-religion relations. And it was a very profoundly significant shift that was occurring in the intellectual domain. It was quite exciting. There's a book called Iran's Intellectual Revolution. I know it's a little bit of shameless self-promotion, but I wrote the book. I looked at this intellectual wave that was sweeping across Iran, and the religious establishment was not immune to it. For a reformation or a renaissance to occur, intellectual fervor by itself is not sufficient. You need to have institutions that support and sustain the new thinking over time. Those institutions in the context of Iran are seminaries, they are mosques, they're universities, they're research institutes, of which there's been a massive proliferation in Iran over the last several decades. You go to Tehran, there is an impressive, incredible array of research institutions that are producing really profoundly important and significant intellectual products. But these intellectual products oftentimes are being produced in a vacuous environment in which they cannot be sustained over time. You don't have the institutional basis of support. Institutional basis of support in terms of informal institutions, the way people think, the way people conceptualize things, but also formal institutions. in terms of state patronage of universities, state patronage of research institutions, state protection of clergy who are thinking differently. There was a class of clerics and a class of intellectuals in Iran in the 2000s called New Thinkers. That was their label, New Thinkers. And these New Thinkers then had to contend with something shockingly called the Special Court for the Clergy, an institution designed specifically to suppress their intellectual production. So, is change possible religiously as long as they don't have political patronage, as long as institutions that are emerging don't have the atmosphere, the environment, the milieu, the context within which they can grow and thrive and give resonance and give meaning, widespread acceptance to new patterns of thought, new patterns of relationship between state and society, between religion, the role of religion in the political process. As long as that hasn't occurred, I don't think the kind of change that the questioner is asking is possible. We might see superficial changes in personalities, but kind of more foundational change in the ideological foundations of the political system they require different dynamics to unfold.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't want to. I keep feeling the need to comment, but okay. So I think I don't see a raised hand here, but I think Belqasem wanted to speak. Belqasem, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kamrava. Very fascinating presentation. I enjoyed hearing to you. I think the Iranian case, it's a little bit the same with the Algerian case. The Algerian regime is very resilient, and one of the major aspects of its resilience is limiting change through change. It happened 3 times in the history of Algeria: in 88, in 2011 in the context of the Arab Spring, and in the last Iraq in 2019. Is it the same case concerning Iran? This is my question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for mentioning Algeria and the comparative and the comparison there. Yes, the only difference is that in Iran, change is much more routine and systematic within the system. Whereas if Bouteflika could have, he would have run for a 7th and 8th term with the constitution being revised. And so those 3 instances that you mentioned were not necessarily major ruptures, but they were major changes in one way or another. So the system in Iran inherits more routine changes within itself than from a comparative from a comparative perspective as compared to the Algerian case. Now, it could very well be that post-Bouteflika Algeria might go the Iranian way in terms of change being kind of more control change being more routine as part of the system's modus operandi, the way the system operates routinely.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava. Any other questions from our participants? I have one question from social media. I kind of get the sense that you already answered it to some degree, but perhaps you can re-answer it. This question says, what role does social welfare and economic development play in the resiliency of the state in Iran?
Plays an incredible role. First of all, the state has done a remarkable job at enhancing social welfare. If all indicators, just before, up until 2018, 2019, Iran scored better, higher on the World Bank's some index of the World
Is that the
Bank.
Human Development Index?
Thank you. Yes, HDI index, Human Development Index, compared to Turkey and Malaysia, scored higher than both of them. But if you go to Iran, and then if you go to Turkey and then go to Malaysia and go to Iran, you would think superficially Iran is poorer than both of them because it's not as developed. It's not as shiny or as new or as glossy. But in terms of Human Development Index, up until the latest round of sanctions, it scored higher on Human Development Index as compared to Turkey. And this is because of something I said during the earlier discussion: vaccination, electrification, ensuring villages have paved roads, ensuring villages have running water, clean water. Every single village has a health clinic. I came across one village where nobody knew it existed up until 1979. It had been so cut off from everything, from the rest of the country, that the village itself was discovered by the state in 1979. And then the state sent surveyors and it sent people to kind of get a census and do all the things that states do. So in terms of basic services and catering to the lowest populations, Iran has done a remarkably good job. This isn't to say that there's no absolute poverty. There is absolute poverty, but it has done an excellent job at reducing that absolute poverty as much as possible, to the extent that is possible. Developmentally, I would like to think of Iran as a country of missed opportunities. There is so much potential. The biggest asset that the country has, the biggest resource, is its human resource. And it's almost as if it does everything and anything it can to get rid of that resource. There is a crisis of migration outside of Iran. Hardly a week goes by without me getting an email from some Iranian PhD student: "Professor, how do I get out of Iran?" And these are some of the best and the brightest that the country has. So in terms of its long-term developmental trajectory, so long as these petty restrictions and these ideological rigidities continue to exist, I think the developmental potential of the country continues to be hampered, if not stopped, but certainly it's hampered and not maximized because of its own self-imposed restrictions.
Thank you. So we have one more question from social media. Which institution contributes most to the resilience of the state, and is there a hierarchy?
Ultimately, for any authoritarian state, the Praetorian institutions are the ones that state relies on when push comes to shove. So the instruments of coercion are the ones that the state relies on in times of need and when the state is in a bind. So the IRGC, whose constitutional mandate it is to protect the revolution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps mandate it is to protect the revolution, is what the state relies on. But we know that no state can rely indefinitely on instruments of coercion alone. It needs legitimation. It needs institutions that help its legitimacy, even if that legitimacy is among a small segment of the population. So I think it's the IRGC on one side and then the rest on the other side. It's the elections, it's the Majlis, the parliament, it's Friday prayer imams, it's the state's own use of the media. I'm chuckling because technically social media is banned. Twitter, for example, is banned, but it's used by Khamenei and everyone else.
Thank you very much. So let me just check. Can I think I'm just gonna ask one of my questions that I had before I go back to the social media questions. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression that, you know, from this discussion a little bit and from your answer to Althea, that there is some legitimacy for Iran's foreign policy domestically, like within Iranian society. And I'm wondering, given your expertise, I don't know much about you know, Iranian public opinion or anything like this. What do you think accounts for you know, this legitimacy for Iranian foreign policy? Is it the Shia connection between Iran and its proxies? Is it kind of just this Iranian sense of nationalism, or is it like race and how historically Iranians view themselves vis-a-vis Afghans and vis-a-vis Arabs, for example?
Yeah, it is nationalism rather than common bonds of identity, whatever those common bonds of identity might be. University of Maryland actually has periodically and regularly engaged in public opinion surveys in Iran. And of course, the veracity and accuracy of any public opinion survey in any authoritarian state is suspect, and something by University of Maryland subcontracting a Turkish public opinion survey company doing research on Iran, or calling Iranians and asking them about their opinion, that's even more suspect. But the baseline that we have, whatever we have, and we need to take that with a grain of salt, indicates that, for example, there's a fair amount of support for Iran's nuclear program, that domestically, the Iranians have a fair amount of sense of national pride riding on it. And that they say, you know what, suck it to these Americans. There was a tremendous support when the Iranians hit the American base with their missiles. There is support for the missile program. And it's funny because, funny or whatever, sometimes when I was giving talks in Iran, and the hot button question that I get asked by university students is the nuclear program. And the questions are always, why should Iran stop its enrichment? Why should Iran abide by this hypocrisy that India has it, Israel has it, Pakistan has it, forget the European Union countries, forget the Americans. Why should Iran not even be allowed to enrich? So the questions revolve around national pride, national identity, nationalism, rather than fraternal bonds with some Iraqi militia, or how Iranians have a perception that they're better than Afghans or Arabs or someone else. So it's these questions. And when it comes to foreign policy, the question becomes, what does our presence in Syria serve us? Yes, everybody knows that Hezbollah, the Lebanese Hezbollah, is Iran's deterrence against Israel. And the only reason why Israel hasn't attacked Iran is because of Hezbollah and the missile capabilities that Hezbollah has. And that's it. That now, whether or not that's true, that's what everybody in Iran believes. But then they ask these questions that, does it serve our national interest to be in Syria? Does it serve our national interest to be selling oil at subsidized prices to the Venezuelans? It does serve Iran's national interest to be in Iraq, and that in some ways is self-evident. So it's not necessarily perceptions of identity, whereas it's perceptions of what is in Iran's interest.
Things to chew on. So I think maybe we have, well, okay, these questions keep coming, sorry. Maybe we have time for two more. The first is, what is the implication of recent events like assassination of Soleimani and Mohsen Fakhrizadeh on the institutional makeup of the state? And the second is, what do you think is the impact of incoming Biden administration policy towards Iran on its security institutions and internal policies?
Okay, so the first question, those are personalities, and those don't necessarily bear on the institutions. Whatever nuclear program Iran has had hasn't necessarily been stopped or set back by the spate of assassinations of nuclear scientists. And Fakhrizadeh is only the latest, probably the most prominent, but only the latest of a whole host of Iranian nuclear scientists who've been assassinated. So institutionally, that hasn't had much consequences. In terms of Qasem Soleimani's assassination, does that have institutional repercussions? I don't think so, but I really don't know. My hunch is that I don't think so. And let me give you a little bit of a background. Qasem Soleimani was really good at establishing ties, at managing these militias, and he had personal connections with these militias. He had charisma. He had this kind of mythical figure, and this mythical figure, by the way, not everybody, but I heard many people in Iran say that it was thanks to the Americans that he had emerged as this kind of mythical figure. That he was just another commander, and then the Americans made him into what he was, and then they made a martyr out of him. And so that is kind of an interesting thing to think about. But he was replaced by someone who was in charge of managing Iran's presence in Afghanistan. And I used to think, when I was thinking about this, I thought that's the area to watch. Afghanistan is the area to watch, because the guy who has replaced Soleimani has pre-existing connections with Iranian proxies in Afghanistan rather than Iraq. And not that I was necessarily true, but what was quite interesting was that this CIA plane went down in Afghanistan. And it just so happened that the CIA plane that went down in Afghanistan had as its passengers a lot of the people who were responsible for Soleimani's assassination. And this was about a month or two after, or a couple of months after Soleimani's assassination. So I kept thinking to myself that we need to look at what's happening in Afghanistan. That hasn't quite happened, or maybe it has happened. But again, I don't think that has institutional consequences, but maybe a shift in focus and a shift in the way that Iran relates to and manages its non-state actor friends and its militia proxies.
So we have one more question from Maria, and I think that this will probably be the last question. So Maria, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Dana. You were talking about the participation, how it was questioned, the participation in Syria, and also somehow I understood the support for Hezbollah because of the presence in Syria. I was wondering what has been the evolution of the popular support for Hezbollah in Iran, for the popular support of Hezbollah in Iran. Did they, for example, like in Arab countries, that they found that when they fought the war against Israel, that they were like real like heroes? Was there the same sense in Iran? And then this has sort of been more questioned as time has passed, and especially through Syrian participation. How much do they think people cost Hezbollah costs Iran in international terms, in domestic terms, economic terms?
Thank you. Let me just clarify. I didn't say Hezbollah necessarily was in Syria, although they are in Syria. But I meant that Iranians don't necessarily question, the population does not necessarily question the government's ties with the Lebanese Hezbollah, because they know and they understand that the Lebanese Hezbollah is a deterrent against Israel. So they disaggregate Hezbollah, the Lebanese Hezbollah, and the way that the Hezbollah acts as a deterrent against Israel. That is a separate from Iran's support of Bashar Assad and the fact that Iranians send so-called advisors to Syria, military personnel actually to Syria. And so Iranian assets are often hit by Israel that is trying to goad Iran into an open conflict. And I think it's not as if there's a groundswell of support for Syria. It's just that people don't question. There's not as if there's a groundswell of support in Iran for Hezbollah, that you go and people say, yeah, we love Hezbollah. No, it's just that they don't necessarily question it. They do question when they get the courage, or when the opportunity comes up, or when the time is right. They question, well, is it worth Iran being in Syria? Is it worth Iran supporting Bashar Assad? Is the carnage in Syria and the reputational costs involved, is that worth it? And I think that's what you get. I don't know if I answered your question, but there's a difference. There's a difference there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamrava, for this great lecture and fascinating discussion. And thank you all to our participants for all of their engagement. So I think that about wraps up our discussion here. We will meet again in half an hour for Bushra's presentation. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody.